November 9th, 1989. Thousands of Berliners are standing on the wall that had divided their city in two for 38 years. Someone is crying, someone is laughing, someone is hammering at the concrete that, just the day before, could have cost a person their life if they tried to cross it. According to official estimates, at least 140 people died over the course of the Berlin Wall's existence while trying to cross it, though researchers still debate the exact number, since the GDR regime concealed some of the cases. And then, in a single night, it was all over. Border guards who, only the evening before, had orders to shoot to kill simply stepped aside that night and let the crowd through. But what happened next? The wall fell in a single night. The city itself, though, took 35 years to grow back together. And, according to many Berliners, it's still growing back together even now. Today we'll walk through the whole path, from the chaos of the first weeks of reunification to the empty factories of the East, from the construction boom on Potsdamer Platz to the parties in abandoned power plants that made Berlin the world's techno capital. We'll look at why one German economist called reunification the most expensive purchase in German history, meet the fates of specific people and neighborhoods, and see what Berlin looks like today. If this topic interests you, hit like. It genuinely helps the channel. Let's begin. Before we talk about the consequences, we need to understand the scale of the problem. After World War II, Berlin wasn't just divided into occupation zones. It was split into two completely different worlds that developed under different economic, political, and even architectural logics for almost 40 years. West Berlin was an island of capitalism inside the GDR, living on subsidies from Bonn. It was a strange city, an enclave of less than 1,000 square kilometers, surrounded on all sides by a foreign state, reachable only by plane or specially designated land corridors. Many West Berliners lived for years with the sense that their city was an island in a hostile sea, and the state deliberately encouraged young people to move there with benefits and exemption from military service. East Berlin, by contrast, was the capital of a socialist state, the showcase of the Soviet bloc. This is where showcase boulevards like Karl Marx Allee were built, and where foreign delegations were brought to demonstrate the successes of socialism. Two currencies, two police forces, two phone networks that weren't even directly connected to each other. Even house numbers and street names in border districts sometimes didn't match up. Planning was done as though the other half of the city simply didn't exist. And then these two worlds suddenly had to become one city. Formally, German reunification took place on October 3rd, 1990, less than a year after the wall fell. That's an insanely fast pace for such a process. For comparison, after the unification of Italy in the 19th century, the economic gap between the country's north and south hadn't disappeared even after 150 years. The decision was made not to gradually bring the two systems together, but to literally introduce the West German Mark, West German laws, and West German administration in East Germany, and as fast as possible. The logic was political. People from the East were fleeing en masse to the West through the open border in Hungary as early as summer '89, and if action wasn't taken quickly, the GDR could simply empty out within a few years. On July 1st, 1990, an event took place that economists still study as a unique case. The East German mark ceased to exist. Every GDR citizen could exchange a certain amount of savings at a one-to-one rate. Even though the East mark's real purchasing power was much lower, and on the black market one West mark bought 4 or even 5 East marks. It was a generous political gesture that gave people an immediate sense of prosperity and confidence in the future. But for East German industry, this gift turned into a catastrophe. In essence, overnight, the production costs of every East German enterprise, converted into hard currency, jumped several times over. Picture a factory in East Berlin or Leipzig that made, say, household appliances or textiles. Yesterday, it sold its goods for East marks to buyers who had no other choice. Imported alternatives simply didn't exist on the shelves. Today, that same factory has to compete with Bosch, Siemens, and AG, while suddenly carrying production costs calculated in a far more expensive currency, equipment that was decades out of date, and labor productivity that economists estimate was, on average, 3 to 4 times lower than in West Germany. Once the artificial shelter of a closed market disappeared, it turned out that the vast majority of East German enterprises simply weren't viable under the new conditions. Export markets in the former socialist bloc, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, were collapsing at the same time. So even enterprises that might have survived Western competition were also losing their traditional Eastern customers. To manage this process, a special agency was created, the Trust Agency, known as the Treuhand. Its job was to privatize or liquidate roughly 8,500 East German state enterprises, which at the time of unification employed several million people. Within a few years, this agency had mostly closed or sold off nearly everything it was given, often for symbolic sums, sometimes literally for 1 mark, as long as the new owner agreed to preserve at least some of the jobs. The consequences for ordinary people were brutal. Millions of East Germans lost their jobs within a few years of unification, and unemployment in the eastern states stayed several times higher than in the West throughout the 90s. In Berlin itself, this hit the East's industrial districts especially hard. Places like Lichtenberg or Marzen, where entire neighborhoods had been built around 1 or 2 large enterprises. When the factory closed, the whole reason the district existed disappeared with it. Not just the jobs, but the daycare centers, clinics, and community centers that same enterprise had funded. The psychological effect was no less significant than the economic one. People who had had guaranteed jobs, free education, childcare, and relative social equality their whole lives suddenly found themselves in a world of competition, unemployment, and uncertainty. Sociologists would later describe this feeling with the German word Abwicklung, roughly, winding down or liquidation, not just of enterprises, but of an entire way of life, a familiar order, status, and self-respect. A telling detail: engineers, doctors, and teachers from the East often discovered that their diplomas and qualifications weren't fully recognized in the West, and sometimes had to retrain or recertify, even with 20 years of professional experience. Many women from the East, where female employment had been far higher than in West Germany and state-run daycare and kindergartens had been the norm, ran into a completely different model. West German society at the time was much more conservative about a woman's role in the family, and the network of childcare facilities was far sparser. And it was precisely then, in the first half of the 90s, that the word nostalgia entered the language. Nostalgia for the East, a play on the German words for East and nostalgia. Not because the GDR had been a paradise. There were no freedoms there, and the Stasi, the secret police, monitored its own citizens on a scale that still astonishes researchers today. By some estimates, nearly 1 in 6 or 7 adults in the country worked for or informed on behalf of it. But a certain stability and social security that vanished along with the old system left a genuine gap behind. And it's precisely this nostalgic feeling that would later fuel an entire industry, from films like Goodbye, Lenin, to shops that specifically sell East German food and beverage brands that survived market competition. Now let's look at the city itself, physically. 1990s Berlin was, arguably, the biggest construction site in Europe that decade. The most vivid symbol is Potsdamer Platz. Before the war, it was one of the busiest intersections in Europe, home to Germany's first traffic light, surrounded by cafes, hotels, and theaters. After the war and the division of the city, this square found itself literally inside the border strip, an empty wasteland between the two sections of the wall, a death strip left undeveloped for decades for security reasons. As late as the 80s, rabbits grazed among the weeds here, and West Berlin tourists climbed onto special wooden viewing platforms just to look over the wall at this dead zone in the heart of the former capital. Already in the early 90s, one of the largest construction projects in modern European history began on this enormous plot in the very center of the city. Major corporations moved in, Daimler-Benz, Sony, and over the following decade, skyscrapers, shopping centers, cinemas, and offices rose here. A place that had been a dead zone for 20 years became the city's new business heart, and the Sony Center complex, with its distinctive tent-shaped roof, became one of the most famous pieces of contemporary German architecture. The second important process was the relocation of the capital. Before unification, the capital of West Germany was the quiet, provincial city of Bonn, deliberately chosen at the time to be modest and small, so it wouldn't claim permanent capital status, since Bonn was officially considered only a temporary seat of government pending reunification. When unification finally happened, Parliament had to make a symbolically weighty decision, and it did so by a razor-thin margin, with just a few dozen votes deciding the matter. So heated was the debate. The government and the Bundestag actually moved in the second half of the 90s, and the process was essentially complete by the end of the millennium. That meant a new wave of construction, of a different kind. The reconstruction of the Reichstag with its famous glass dome by British architect Norman Foster, a symbolic gesture of transparency in government, letting citizens literally look down on parliamentary sessions from above. The building of a new government quarter along the Spree River, the construction of embassies from around the world, which relocated en masse from Bonn back to Berlin. A separate and highly contentious story concerns the fate of buildings tied to GDR symbolism. The Palace of the Republic, a grand building of bronze glass in the very center of Berlin, where the East German parliament had once sat while also housing concert halls and restaurants for ordinary citizens, was closed after unification due to asbestos found inside, and, after years of debate, was fully demolished in the 2000s. In its place, already in the 21st century, a reconstruction of the Berlin City Palace, the residence of Prussian kings that the GDR had itself torn down, was built. This decision remains controversial to this day. For some, it's a restoration of historical justice. For others, a symbolic erasure of East German heritage from the city's map. But alongside this glittering new construction, a very different Berlin existed, a city of empty buildings. After the wall fell, many buildings in the central districts, especially in the east, were left in legal limbo. Who owned them? Whether they should be returned to pre-war owners or their descendants? What to do with structures that had stood abandoned for years right next to the wall? The process of restitution, returning property, dragged on for years of court cases and became a major headache for the newly unified city. And it was precisely this emptiness that laid the groundwork for the next phenomenon we're about to discuss. Picture this: a huge number of empty buildings, unclear legal status, almost no police attention during the chaotic early years, cheap, often outright free, rent. For young people, artists, and musicians from all over the world, this turned out to be an ideal environment unlike anywhere else in Europe. In the districts of Prenzlauer Berg, Friedrichshain, and Mitte, in the former East, an entire squatting culture emerged, self-occupied buildings where artists, musicians, and activists lived and worked. By some estimates, in Friedrichshain alone in the early 90s, several dozen such squats existed at the same time. Some of these squats were later legalized through negotiations with the city government. Some were evicted years later during the gentrification wave of the 2000s, and some turned into legendary cultural spaces that still operate today. It was during these years that a phenomenon was born which would make Berlin famous the world over: technoculture. Abandoned power plants, underground bunkers, old factories, even former bank vaults. All of it suddenly became available space for parties that could last not just one night, but entire weekends. One of the most famous clubs in the world, Berghain, is housed in a former thermal power plant, and the club's very name combines the names of two districts on either side of the old border: Friedrichshain and Kreuzberg, literally symbolizing the reunification of the city's two halves. This wasn't just a musical subculture. Sociologists and Berliners themselves often describe the early 90s techno movement as a way for the young generation from both East and West to literally dance through the ruins of the old division, on neutral ground, in abandoned spaces that belonged to neither side of the old city. For many young people, that first shared dance floor was the first place they ever met peers from the other Berlin. This reputation as a cheap, free, creative city held for decades and became the foundation of the New Berlin brand, a city that drew artists from London, startup founders from Silicon Valley, and musicians from around the world. Because here, unlike in Paris or London, you could sustain a creative life for years without much money. There's even a phrase from former Berlin Mayor Klaus Wowereit, who called his city poor but sexy, a line that became almost the official slogan of Berlin identity for 2 decades to come. But behind the vivid cultural picture, a reality still lurks that sociologists call the wall in the head, Mauer im Kopf. The physical wall came down within a few years. The mental and economic gap disappeared far more slowly. Even 2 or 3 decades after unification, average wages and pensions in East Germany remained noticeably lower than in the West, and unemployment remained higher. Young people from the East moved west in large numbers looking for work, which meant that some East German cities, unlike Berlin itself, lost population for decades, and entire regions, especially rural areas of the former GDR, faced a problem of aging and youth outflow with no parallel in the west of the country. Within Berlin itself, the difference between the former East and West is still visible today. It's just taken a different shape. Former Eastern districts in the center, Mitte, Prenzlauer Berg, went through massive gentrification and are now among the most expensive in the city. Old, rundown buildings were restored and now cost enormous sums, while the very squatters and artists who made these districts fashionable in the first place mostly can't afford to live there anymore and have moved further out to the periphery. Meanwhile, the peripheral eastern districts built during GDR times as prefab housing estates, Marzahn, Hohenschönhausen, Hellersdorf, still have a reputation as poorer neighborhoods with different demographics and different social problems. In other words, the geography of the divide has remained, but its meaning has flipped. Once poor West Berlin Kreuzberg, right next to the wall, where mostly Turkish guest workers and punk youth settled in the 70s and 80s, has now become a fashionable and expensive district, while the once privileged center of the GDR has turned into prime real estate, even as the typical East German. Bedroom communities are still associated with lower incomes. Politically, this divide hasn't disappeared either. In Eastern Germany overall, and partly in Berlin's eastern peripheral districts, support for both far-right and far-left parties has traditionally run higher than in the west of the country. Researchers link this to the sense that the blossoming landscapes, promised by Chancellor Helmut Kohl right after unification, never fully materialized for everyone, and to a decades-long accumulated feeling that the East's interests were considered secondary in unified Germany, a country that was, in effect, built on West German rules that the East had almost no part in shaping. Still, there's a flip side. The generation born after 1990 increasingly doesn't identify itself through the categories of Eastern or Western German at all. For young Berliners born in the 2000s, the East-West divide is now mostly their parents' and grandparents' history, not their own lived experience that today's Berlin is a completely different city from the one it was right after the wall fell. The city's population has long since passed 3.5 million, and it keeps growing thanks to migrants from all over the world, not just from other parts of Germany, but from Syria, Turkey, Ukraine, Russia, from southern European countries hit hard by the 2000s financial crisis, and, after Brexit, from Britain too, as some Britons and expats living in Europe deliberately chose Berlin as their new home. Berlin's reputation as a cheap and free city, the very thing people loved about it in the 2000s, has largely faded into the past. Over the last 10 to 15 years, rents in Berlin have risen at one of the fastest rates of any major European city, and what once drew artists and musicians here precisely because housing was affordable is now often cited as an example of just how much the city has changed. Berlin even tried to impose strict rent controls, the so-called Mietendeckel, but Germany's constitutional court later struck that measure down, after which rents kept climbing. At the same time, Berlin has become one of the leading tech and startup hubs in continental Europe, home to a large number of fintech, e-commerce, and other technology companies, competing for that status with London and Paris. Former industrial spaces and factory floors, once occupied by techno clubs and artist studios, are now frequently converted into co-working spaces and startup offices. One more illustration of how the same spaces in the city kept changing function over 3.5 decades. As for the wall itself, today, only a few fragments remain, deliberately preserved as memorial sites. The Berlin Wall Memorial on Bernauer Straße, with a reconstructed border strip and a watchtower. And of course, the famous East Side Gallery, the longest surviving stretch of the wall, painted by artists from around the world right after it fell, which has become an open-air museum drawing millions of tourists every year. The line of the former border is still marked today by a different colored strip of cobblestones set right into the sidewalk, so that residents and tourists alike never forget exactly where the line once ran that divided living people, families, and friends into two worlds. And near the former Checkpoint Charlie, the most famous border crossing of the Cold War, tourists now pose for photos every day with actors dressed as American soldiers, and this spot is often cited as an example of how the Cold War's most tragic symbols turned into a piece of mass tourism. The story of Berlin after the wall fell is a story about how much harder it is to unite people than to tear down a concrete barrier. A political decision can be made in a few months, An economic system can be rebuilt in a few years. But bridging the gap in experience, habits, and expectations between two generations that lived in parallel realities, 35 years hasn't even been enough for that. And yet it's precisely this complicated, contradictory history, a mix of economic shock, creative freedom, cultural explosion, and slow healing, that made modern Berlin what it is. Imperfect, more expensive than many of its residents would like, with political fault lines still visible at the ballot box, but still one of the most interesting and most alive cities in Europe. A place where history is literally built into the cobblestones underfoot. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe. More stories about cities that change the world are coming. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.